So this is review of muscle structure and function part 2, and this is kind of the fun part because we start to identify how and why muscles function in real life. You learned in your anatomy text and anatomy classes that muscles have an origin and an insertion and an action, and oftentimes those actions that we learn about in anatomy in the textbook don't necessarily apply to real life. So this is a review of some of the principles on why things may not necessarily apply to real life that we learn in anatomy. So this is kind of a fun part for me, and because it really builds on what we're going to talk about when we come back next week and start talking about the hip and the interrelated function of the joint and muscle structure that surround the hip. So when I look at active muscle tension, this is directly related to that discussion that we had last time on cross-bridge facilitation, cross-bridge hookup. And when I have a muscle that's between roughly 100 and 120% of its normal resting length, that's when I have the greatest number of opportunities for cross bridges to hook up. So I can have the greatest number or the greatest amount of tension developed in that range. If I shorten the muscle, there becomes an overlap of cross bridges, and there's not an adequate number of connection sites for the actin and myosin to hook up with. So in a muscle that is in a shortened length or a shortened state, I will not be able to produce the maximum amount of tension that's available within that muscle under normal length conditions. On the flip side, if I've taken a muscle and lengthened it, so I've lengthened it out past that 120% of its normal resting length, I start to pull the cross bridges apart so that there is, again, an inadequate number of sites for the cross bridges to connect to. The further I stretch it, the further apart those cross bridges become, and the fewer and fewer linkage sites are available. So if I take a muscle to its end range lengthened position, I can no longer generate an adequate amount of tension or force within the muscle. So there's an optimal position that a muscle wants to be, and that optimal position is roughly that 100 to 120% of its normal resting length. Positions of excessive shortening result in the inability to generate tension, as well as positions of length, excessive length, create positions of an inability to generate tension. So a good example of this is the when a police officer is apprehending a suspect and he's got a knife in his hand. So what does he do? He takes his shoulder into full extension, his elbow into full extension, and wrist into full flexion, and that produces a position where that bad guy can't generate enough force and can't bring his arm forward. And it makes it much easier. That's why it's a lot easier to handcuff somebody with their hands behind their back. They lose the ability to generate force. They become mechanically disadvantaged, and they're mechanically disadvantaged because they don't have an adequate number of cross bridges to connect. When I look at a force tension length tension curve from a passive perspective, so now I generate a load as I move to my normal resting length and hit the peak. I end up with maximum cross bridge connection. But as my previous graph shows, if I continue to develop length, my ability to generate active tension goes down. But we'll see that as I continue to lengthen that muscle, I start to get a load that starts to go up. And that's passive tension. Passive tension is the tension that is developed in the non-contractile elements within the muscle. What are those non-contractile elements within the muscle? Well, remember we talked about tendons. Tendons are non-contractile. They have the ability to lengthen a little bit, 6 to 8% of their length. That's their ability to change their shape. So it's not a lot, but there is a little bit. But the epimysium and the paramysium, the connective tissue that surrounds the muscle, the connective tissue that surrounds the fasciculi, and the connective tissue that surrounds the muscle fibers individually, all are passive structures that will resist lengthening. So they'll develop tension when they're stretched. So when I look at the length-tension relationship of a muscle, not just a muscle cell, but now of an entire muscle, I have, at that shortened position, the ability to generate tension as I move toward my resting length, and then it starts to flatten out here a little bit and drop a little bit as I lose my ability to generate active tension. But now I'm starting to stretch those non-contractile elements. So those non-contractile elements are also called serial elastic components, SEC, serial elastic components. They will then continue to generate tension as we lengthen the muscle to a greater degree. At some point, what's going to happen though? They're going to break, and then we're going to lose all tension. So when I look at total tension, it's a combination of my passive tension, which are those serial elastic components, the tendons and the connective tissue, and a combination of the active tension, which are also known as parallel elastic components. So parallel, muscle fibers run in parallel. So I have parallel elastic components, serial elastic components. Those combined create total tension. So that's an important component because that's part of what helps preload a muscle prior to its ability to generate force. And as we get further along in looking at different types of contractions, we'll also have the ability to look at that as well. So what are different types of contractions? Well, the first one we want to talk about is just an isometric contraction. Isometric is a little bit of a misnomer, but we're gonna go with it anyway. And an isometric contraction is a muscle that is generating force, but there is no motion occurring at the joint. So there is load developing without motion. We might think of that as a stabilizing component. So we will have some isometric muscular contractions to stabilize a scapula while the arm is moving. So isometric we think of as kind of globally as well, nothing's moving, I'm holding something, but it also is a component of stabilizing. The next type of muscle contraction we want to look at is a concentric muscle contraction, and that's where the muscles are generating tension and they're shortening while they are generating that tension. So the muscle is shortening, the joint is moving through its range and allowing allowing the shortening to occur. So the force generated in the muscle, the tension generated in the muscle exceeds the external load of the center of gravity of the moving limb, in this case her arm, and the amount of the weight. Now if I took and placed 3,000 pounds in her hands, she probably wouldn't move it. And she might attempt to move it, in which case it would come back and become an isometric contraction. But as long as the load in the muscle exceeds the external load, we'll have a concentric muscle contraction. The muscle fibers will shorten as they are developing tension. And then the last type is an eccentric or eccentric muscle contraction. And that's when the load or the tension developed within the muscle is less than the external load. So the muscle is generating tension, but at the same time, it's lengthening. Now, it's lengthening, and as a function of that length, the parallel and the serial elastic components are increasing their tension. So with an eccentric muscle contraction, we're going to see a greater application of force or tension contributed by the serial elastic components. So what do muscles do? Well, we can identify them and we can call them prime movers. Also, sometimes we'll call prime movers agonists. Sometimes they are assistant movers. So they may not be responsible for the primary motion, but they may assist in some secondary component, either secondary motion within the primary mover, or may assist or may help the primary mover complete the task. There are muscles that are antagonists. They are typically those muscles that are in opposition to the prime mover. If we look from a neurological perspective, usually the antagonists are in a position of reciprocal inhibition, so they're not active during movement. So if I'm looking at my soccer kick, the hip flexors are active. They would be a prime mover. The glutes would be antagonistic to hip flexion. They would be the antagonists. And then I can look at stabilizers and neutralizers. And we're going to spend a lot of time as we talk about each joint individually on stabilizers or neutralizers, because I really think they're kind of underserved. They're the poor stepchildren that become abused and get sent to the room. Nobody talks about them. But we're gonna bring them out of the room, and we're gonna talk about them, because they're the ones that really are responsible for putting everything together, and they're responsible for allowing normal motion to occur when we start looking at function and we start looking at what it means to walk and what it means to run and what it means to cut and what it means to change directions. So those stabilizers and neutralizers are vitally important components of normal movement patterns and normal function. And when we look at those prime movers and those primary functional muscles, we're going to put them all together. Now, some of the other things that are going to influence one's ability to generate force is how muscles cross the joints, and the types of joints that they're crossing. So if I look at a elbow flexion or an arm curl movement, and I've got my biceps and my brachialis and the brachioradialis all identified in our picture, we can look at just the angle of the muscle fibers, and we can recognize that I'm going to have a much greater impact for rotary force by the biceps brachii and the brachialis than I am by the orientation of the fibers from brachioradialis. Brachioradialis is going to provide me with much greater stabilizing factors than my primary elbow movers, but I'm not going to have as much rotary, whereas I'm going to have much greater rotary components than I am stabilizing components. So the angle of attachment will have a huge impact on one's ability to generate or influence or generate force around a joint. Obviously, the type of joint that it crosses will have an impact. So my elbow is a hinge joint, and motion in this movement is only occurring in a flexion and extension direction. If it was a ball and socket joint and I had more motion occurring in a multiplanar direction, multi-axial type of movement, then these muscles would also have an impact on rotation, would have an impact on abduction and adduction. So the type of joint that the muscle crosses has a significant impact on the ability to generate force around that joint. Now another component is multi-joint muscles. I'm looking at hamstrings here, and hamstrings are are attached up on the pelvis, and they come down and attach on the tibia. So they're crossing both the knee and the hip. So if a muscle is crossing more than one joint, that will influence its ability to generate force, especially when we look at the position that the joints are in when we are trying to generate or develop tension or move through space. So it comes back to that concept that we had of active and passive tension, and we have this new term called passive and active insufficiency. So I come back and I look at my length tension relationship again, and I have active and passive insufficiency. And that's really the part of the curve when I have an inability for cross bridges to connect, whether it's because they're too short or if it's because they're too long. So when I'm in this side of the curve where I have tremendous overlap, I'm in a position of active insufficiency. And when I'm in this aspect of the curve, when I have cross bridges that are too far apart, I'm in a position of passive insufficiency. So it becomes a situation where the only the only tension developing becomes that from passive structures or those serial elastic structures. So active and passive insufficiency is really a function of a multi-joint muscle and where the joints are, what position the joints that it crosses in terms of allowing the length of the muscle to maintain an optimal position. So if I have a joint if I have a muscle that crosses two joints and I'm extending at one end and flexing at the other end, I may have the opportunity to stay within that optimal length tension to maximize movement and maximize tension at both ends of the muscle and across both joints. Now the other thing that's really important that will influence force is receptors. And we have a lot of receptors, and I'm going to talk about receptors individually when we start talking about the hip and specific movements that occur in the hip. But there's a couple I want to talk about first, and those are sensory receptors, both muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs, GTOs, Golgi tendon organs. And a muscle spindle is in the muscle fiber. It's embedded in the muscle fiber, and it is responsible for measuring tension or length within the muscle fiber. It measures length within the muscle fiber, and it measures both active length and passive length, ballistic length and a slow stretch. So if you slowly stretch a muscle and you start to notice that, hey, as I stretch this thing, the tone starts to go up. I can feel tension developing within the muscle. And that's because you are starting to stimulate the intrafusal fibers in the nuclear chain of the muscle spindle. If you quickly stretch a muscle, it'll contract. So it opposes that length change. It doesn't allow you to generate excessive length, and it's in one respect it's a protective mechanism, so that it doesn't allow you to take a joint through its end range. It starts to develop tension, so it protects the joint. But it also helps us to generate a stronger muscle contraction. So if we preload the muscle spindle, we stretch the muscle spindle a little bit, it turns around and sends a signal back down the extrafusal fiber and tells the muscle fiber to increase tone, or in some cases even develop a significant contraction. So we can use muscle spindles to stimulate a muscular response, and from a training perspective, we'll want to do that. Now, its brother, the Golgi tendon organ, is just kind of there to check that we're not generating too much load within the muscle. So the Golgi tendon organ it kind of hangs out in the tendon musculocutaneous, or excuse me, the musculotendinous junction, and it's responsible for measuring tension within the tendon. And as tension goes up in the tendon, it sends a signal along that afferent neuron that turns around and inhibits, slows down the influence of the motor unit along the extrafusal fiber. So as I increase tone or tension within the tendon says, I don't want you to get too strong. I don't want you tearing me off the bone. I'm going to inhibit muscular load, muscular tension. So as a result, the heavier load that we lift, the greater we stimulate the Golgi tendon organ, the less force we're able to generate. So what do you think training does on either one of these? Well, if I look at a muscle spindle, I may be able to train the muscle spindle to help assist in a muscle contraction. And I may be able to train the Golgi tendon organ to say, hey, you know what? I've loaded these tendons correctly. I've done it over time. I'm getting a positive growth response. You don't have to work quite so hard. Let me lift more weight. Let me generate more force. And that's part of what happens in a training situation is I improve the function of the Golgi tendon organ, and I improve the function of the muscle spindle. And as a result, I can generate more force, a more controlled and a more coordinated muscular contraction. And I get stronger, I get faster, and move better as a result. So we can also look at how our muscle functions from a force velocity perspective. Now this is a curve that represents the force velocity. So on my y-axis I have my force or tension, if we want to look at it from tension perspective, and along my x-axis I have velocity, so the speed at which something is shortening or lengthening, if I'm looking at from the eccentric or eccentric side. And at v equals 0 is isometric, so I have no load at all. So as I start to increase a contraction in a concentric manner, in other words, I am developing a load and I'm developing it faster and faster. As I develop that load, my ability to generate force goes down. Now the caveat to this is an example of an isokinetic contraction. And what do I mean by isokinetic? Isokinetic means same, iso same, speed. So do we live in an isokinetic world? Not really. An isokinetic graph like this would come off of somebody on an isokinetic training device like a Biodex or Kincom or Cybex, something that we can fix the speed at 60 degrees per second, for example, or 120 degrees per second. And at that fixed speed, the faster I'm going with a concentric type of contraction, the less ability I have to generate force. And the reason is I don't have enough time to generate cross-bridge connections. So I am lacking the ability to generate cross-bridge connections, and as a result, I can't generate as much force. So the faster I move, the faster it shortens, the less force I can generate. Well, then you'd say, well, wait a minute. I'm looking at an eccentric contraction, and as the faster that I get, the same rule applies, right? Because if I'm going faster eccentrically, I should be in the same boat. I shouldn't have any more time to look at cross-bridge connections. So you would think that that graph would come down, but it doesn't. It goes up. And why is that? And the reason that it goes up is the tension and the load that those serial elastic components, the tendons and the non-contractile tissue that surrounds the muscle, is able to absorb and generate and store, allows me to generate more force the faster that I go eccentrically. And that's an important component, because when I'm looking at active muscle function and how we change directions or move or jump, and when you go and attempt to jump up and touch the rim of the basketball court, what do you do first? You drop down. You drop down before you jump up. And what you're doing when you're dropping down is you're stimulating the muscle spindles, because you're stretching the muscle, you're preloading the muscle, and you're preloading these serial elastic components. So we're getting a load here, at which then we can release as we jump towards the basket, release that energy, have increased muscle function, have increased ability to generate forces to maximize our vertical jump. So those are the principles that we're going to really hone in on when we're talking about normal movement, normal function, and when we start talking about the hip next week. We have a little writing assignment due at the end of this week, and it's like I said, it's just a page long and or less than a page. It doesn't have to be a page. I'm looking at content, not volume, and I'll give you guys a chance to look at this before I post it. But it is the ability to kind of take some of these principles that we've talked about and see if you can apply them to an activity that you might see in the gym. All right, so have fun with it, and until next time.